what have you seen happening in Australia and the West? And what have you been thinking about this?
Well, it's incredibly messy and hard to think your way through it all. And at the very bottom line, I don't want to sound like I'm smug, sort of has-been who knows it all and could have done it better. These are sobering times, and we've got to ask a lot of questions. I think my starting point, though, Jordan, would be to say, and this is our little mantra with my own video series, you can't get good public policy without a good debate. And there's a lot of elements to a good debate. You've got to have a decent level of understanding. You've got to ensure the debate's not truncated. You've got to ensure that everybody's involved. You've got to try and demystify it and depoliticise it. I think on all of those fronts, there have been severe failings internationally and in Australia. Australia's response has been quite unique, partly for historical reasons, partly for geographical reasons, partly because of the unusual nature of our federation, partly because the Australian people are surprisingly comfortable with a big state, with a lot of government involvement in their lives. We are, as I understand it, getting some quite even mocking press internationally at the moment for the nature of our lockdowns. They have been very severe, longer and more severe in Victoria and in Melbourne, our second largest city, I think, than anywhere apart from in Brazil, of all things. And I am concerned. I'm concerned about the balances that have emerged. I'm concerned about the misinformation, about the lack of ability for the Australian people to think through clearly. They started out trusting governments and medical authorities. That trust has been badly damaged. There's now an acceptance we can't go on like this. So I have to say, in the end, I am optimistic, I think, that our institutions will survive this. The Australian people will say, this is enough. We've got to come back to a pragmatic middle ground. Whether governments will give back everything they should is a big question. But I make this point in the context of the horrendous range of really difficult challenges that confront us. One thing you must note about Australia, I think, internationally, and has been noted, is that we have clearly chosen the democracy and freedom in the face of an attempt by an authoritarian China to say, bow your knees to our authoritarian regime and way of life. So there's cause for real optimism there that Australians understand freedom, even though we don't talk about it much in this country.
And so, well, let's talk about that example with regard to China to begin with. So can you flesh that out a little bit? What did you see? What threat did you see China imposing precisely when, and what did you see the Australian people managing in response to that?
Well, China, of course, we're one of the few countries in the world that runs a massive trade surplus with China. They suck in massive amounts of our product. Around a third of our exports go to China, and even though we import a lot back from them, we do very, very well out of it. And now we have, I think, perhaps along with the rest of the world, assumed that with liberalisation in trade, with rising living standards, more opportunities for a Western-style life, liberalism would take over in China. We know that over the last 7 or 8 years, those hopes have been well and truly dashed. That is becoming a very authoritarian regime. And Australia called for a full and proper inquiry into COVID so that we could better understand it and cope with future pandemic threats more effectively. We certainly led a little with the chin, I'd have to say, on that one. The reaction from China was very unfriendly indeed, and ultimately they issued a list of 14 major grievances, and so that we have broken the relationship. No one will pick up the call in China at a senior level in response to our senior people. Canada's experienced a similar freezing out, but it's been very focused on Australia because we're in the region and because of that call for the COVID inquiry. Also, I think the other thing, and was listed in the 14 grievances, was our insistence that Huawei, we were the first country that said that the telecommunications giant should not be allowed to implement itself, embed itself in our telecommunications system for security reasons. America followed, Europe, the rest of the world slowly. And I think that's been a cause of real angst. But the point is that I think the Chinese thought we would bend quite quickly, and Australia hasn't. Notwithstanding the fact that, in common with other countries, you've seen a lot of business leaders saying, "Oh, don't go too far. This trade's important." But as Henry Kissinger put it, a little trade lost can always be recovered. Freedom lost is almost impossible to get back.
Yeah, well, okay, so there's a number of conundrums that sort of emerge out of that because, you're making the case that the Australians have girded their loins, so to speak, in the face of an external political and economic threat, despite the fact that there might be relatively serious economic consequences to that. And so that will to maintain freedom and that fear of external, not fear precisely, but wariness of external authoritarianism, we still see that as alive and well. But we've seen throughout the West, and maybe it's exacerbated in the case of Australia, the willingness to dispense with civil liberties on the domestic front in the face of the pandemic threat. And I wonder first about the legality of such moves. It seems to me that if the lockdowns and the mandatory vaccination policies are in fact constitutionally valid in countries like Australia and Canada and perhaps the US and of course Europe, that our civil liberties aren't very well protected at all. And then I also wonder what will happen to us, broadly speaking, when the next influenza pandemic sweeps through. Like now that we've established lockdowns as acceptable, what level of threat justifies their imposition? How serious does it have to be? And these are, so then I worry about the lockdowns and certainly about the ethics of the mandatory vaccination campaign. Now, I'm vaccinated twice, and my wife is as well, although I have family members who have refused it. And so the division that you see politically and philosophically runs through my family. And I'm not claiming any moral superiority in the fact that I got vaccinated. There are a variety of reasons for it, and I won't go into them. But I'm sympathetic to those who are leery of the mandatory vaccination as policy or the vaccinations per se because they have health objections or ethical objections. And so, well, that's sort of my domain of concern. And so I'm wondering how it appears to you.
Well, I've been doing a lot of thinking about it, and I offer these as thoughts only. I think and there's so many of them, Jordan, I hardly know where to start. But I think the first thing I'd say is that in a democracy, we do enter into a contract, if you like, a compact, in which we say we'll surrender those rights, but hopefully no more than those rights, which are necessary to secure the rights and freedoms of others. And that may from time to time vary. That's a logical conclusion. So if you think of, as a friend of mine pointed out here the other day, think of the Blitz during the darkest days of the Second World War in Britain. I think the social contract, if you like, was strong enough for people to accept that you had to make sure there was no light escaping from your house at night. You had to have black curtains drawn so there was no light, so the Luftwaffe pilots couldn't see London and you and your neighbours were safe. And it was accepted that the police would have the right to barge into your house and say there's a chink of light showing there, cover it up. And you had no right of conscientious objection almost to that. That was an extreme example. So we're talking proportionality here. It's important to note, of course, that if you follow it through to its logical extent, well before the war technically ended, the British people said, right, we've been through this terrible disaster, we want our freedoms back. And they actually voted Winston Churchill out of office. I see that as a strong declaration. This crisis is over. We have accepted unbelievably punitive measures, restricted our freedoms, placed ourselves at great risk. It's over. We now want to normalise. Then you come right back to this situation that we're now fronting. Well, the legal implications are massive in this country. I've just literally learnt from my news service here in Australia that President Biden has decided that all companies in America who employ more than 100 people must ensure that all their workforce is vaccinated. That's 80 million Americans, compulsory.
The companies must do that.
Sorry?
You said that that's the company's responsibility to ensure that. So does that mean that the decision about what healthcare is appropriate has now been ceded by the U.S. government to corporate interests? And where the hell is that going to end precisely? I mean, COVID is a nasty illness, but it's not as bad as it could be by any stretch of the imagination. And it's some multiple worse than a bad flu epidemic, but it's in the same general ballpark. And so these precedents are being established at an unprecedented rate. And there's a principle underneath it, which is, well, you can't be too safe. And the answer to that is, or the rejoinder to that is, that may be true, but don't be so sure that the policies that are put in hypothetically to ensure your safety are going to have that effect and no others. And so, and I know there's a professor in Canada who's, and I only know the edges of this story. She's a professor of ethics, and she has been questioning the mandatory vaccination policy on Nuremberg grounds, essentially, that it's a violation of that enforced medical treatment, the idea that medical treatment can be enforced by the state. In one of our provinces, there were no exceptions, no religious exceptions, no exceptions for health reasons, no exceptions, period. It's like, okay, but where does that end? Like, what is it? I do all sorts of things that are hypothetically dangerous to other people, like drive, for example, which I suspect is far more dangerous than COVID. And yet I'm allowed to do that. You know, we're setting a very strange precedent here. And that's a hell of a law that's just been passed.
Thank you for watching this episode. We appreciate your support. If you value vital conversations like this one, be sure to subscribe to the channel there and also click the notification bell to stay up to date with new releases.